Good day. Today is the second day of apparently an increased volume of Russian missile strikes on Ukraine, though my overall sense is that there's been a significant reduction in the level of missile strikes as compared with the very large number of missile strikes which took place over the course of yesterday. By the way, I've come across entirely discordant numbers for the number of missiles which the Russians are supposed to have launched at Ukraine yesterday. One widely quoted number which I have seen is 75, but I've seen other figures which put the number between 50 and 300. Well, I'm not going to try and guess. I'm not in any kind of position to guess. What I'm going to say about these missile strikes, however, are a number of things. Firstly, and contrary to some of the commentary that I've seen in the West over the last couple of days, it seems that the actual number of civilians killed as a result of these missile strikes is relatively light. The most widely quoted figure coming from Ukrainian sources is 14 people in total, though I believe I'm going to guess that the actual number is higher, because I suspect that the Ukrainians are not disclosing the number of Ukrainian officials who may have been killed or at least injured in the strike on the Ukrainian SBU headquarters in Kiev. By the way, and perhaps a sign of how sensitive that particular strike is, I noticed that Ukraine has admitted that the head of its cybersecurity service, who is presumably a member of the SBU, was killed over the course of the missile strikes yesterday. They claim that he was killed in a car that was driving along Shevchenko Avenue in Kiev. Seems to me inherently more likely that he was killed at his desk or at his office in the SBU building, and perhaps there's a desire by Ukraine not to publicize that fact. Let me stress again, that's my opinion. It's a guess. I may be completely wrong. Perhaps he was killed in a car as he was driving along Shevchenko Avenue, in which case clearly he was extremely unlucky. But anyway, that's the overall sense. The missile strikes don't seem to have killed large numbers of civilians. They do seem to have done significant, though probably temporary, damage to Ukraine's energy and power system, which seems to have been one of the initial targets. I say one of the initial targets because there's also suggestions that some military facilities were also targeted. Now, I'm going to venture an opinion, which is that there's been a great deal of speculation in the alternative and Russian media that the purpose of these strikes was not to knock out the Ukrainian power system entirely, but rather to test it, to see how vulnerable its component parts were, to get a sense of its vulnerabilities, of the resources Ukraine has to undertake repairs, to learn more about it, in other words, in preparation for more intense and sustained strikes, which will probably take place later in winter. And that's, I think, the most plausible explanation for what has happened, for what happened yesterday. Perhaps there was an element of warning about it, but it seems to me that the Russians are gradually edging towards a position where they are moving towards a proper war, an attack on Ukraine's energy system. And there's been an article in Dancing with Bears, a magazine, an internet website run by John Helmer, a veteran correspondent of Russian affairs, in which John Helmer suggests that in fact the Ukrainian energy system has been steadily declining ever since the start of the war. It's been gradually degrading, and he appears to believe that at some point over the next few weeks or months it will finally completely break down. What was interesting about Helmer's piece is that it was actually written before these missile strikes took place. I can't comment on how correct or not it is. This is a matter both outside my personal knowledge and my technical areas of expertise. But can I just say I have no reason to doubt the information, and perhaps that is indeed where we're heading. And it seems to me plausible that that is precisely where, in fact, we're heading. Now, there's been some other aspects of these missile attacks which have been quite interesting, and that is that the Ukrainian air defense system completely broke down. It proved unable to cope with the volume of these missile strikes. It was rapidly degraded, and as far as I can tell, the great majority of the missiles actually hit their targets. And this apparently resulted in a panicky call from President Zelensky to President Biden of the United States, over the course of which President Zelensky apparently begged President Biden for air defense systems, which, according to the White House readout, President Biden assured President Zelensky that the United States would indeed supply. Now, I don't know what sort of air defense system the United States is indeed intending to supply, but I'm going to make a guess that whatever it is, it's not going to make very much difference to the overall situation. Ukraine's existing air defense system seems to rely very heavily on Soviet systems, legacy Soviet systems from the 1980s, like the S-300 and the Buk missile system, and systems of that kind. And as I said, it failed to cope with the more recent attacks. With these recent missile attacks, I suspect that it will be extremely difficult to graft onto a system, an air defense system reliant upon Soviet technologies of the 1980s and presumably organized around those technologies, an entirely different air defense system of the sort that's been developed by the United States. There's a further factor, however, here at play, which is that, as many military commentators point out, the United States doesn't actually have the kind of integrated air defense system that Ukraine arguably needs. This is because the United States, in developing its air defenses, has tended to rely less on surface-to-air missiles, which are the basis of the kind of air defense system that first the Soviet Union and now Russia have, but rather on fighter jets, in which the United States has, of course, historically, ever since the Second World War, been a global leader. And I don't think there's any realistic possibility that Ukraine is going to acquire US fighter jets before the winter, when whatever Russian missile strikes on its air defense system and its energy system are likely to take place. And those surface-to-air missiles that the United States does have, such as the Patriot system, for example, don't seem to be, and this isn't just my view, but it isn't really my view, it's the view of many other people, it just doesn't seem to be as effective as the Russian systems, or even perhaps some of the Soviet legacy systems that Ukraine uses. Now, this is not, by the way, a criticism of the US military. The US military has elected, it's made a decision to focus on fighter jets and take a kind of proactive air defense based on aggressive use of fighter jets in preference to the more reactive system that the Soviets and then the Russians developed, which is based on surface-to-air missiles. It's just to say that the two systems are different. And as I said, that the prospects of grafting the American system, onto an old Soviet system seem to me, well, insuperable, certainly in any time frame that Ukraine is likely to have. So there we go. I mean, it looks as if Ukraine is suffering severe problems in terms of its air defenses, and its energy system is looking increasingly vulnerable, and one gets the sense that the Russians are gradually developing a better understanding of it in preparation of how to launch overwhelming strikes against it. Now, alongside the air defense failure of the Ukrainian air defense system, there is what looks to me like an increasingly embarrassing intelligence failure. Now, way back the first week or so of March, I remember reading articles, especially in the Daily Telegraph, based on the usual anonymous intelligence sources telling us that the Russians were about to run out of missiles. And there's been a steady drumbeat. I read article after article about this, steady drumbeat of these claims that's been persisting for week after week, month after month. There have been some really very bizarre claims along the way as well. Twice the Daily Telegraph has run articles explaining that the reason the Russians are running out of missiles, one of the reasons that the Russians are supposedly running out of missiles, specifically cruise missiles, is that their cruise missiles rely upon engines made by the Motorsic factory in Zaporozhye in Ukraine. And since Ukraine isn't obviously supplying these engines to Russia any longer, the Russians don't have any engines, lack engines for their missiles. And of course, another variant claim is that the Russians have run out of microchips to insert in these missiles, and that's why they're running out of missiles. Now, these articles, these claims, which clearly stem from Western intelligence sources, extend all the way back, as I said, to the first 2 weeks of March. Well, yesterday and again today, we've had a huge surge in Russian missile strikes. There is no sign at the moment, none at all, that the Russians are running out of missiles or are unable to produce missiles. Now, perhaps sensing the embarrassment about the fact that these repeated claims that that the Russian stock of these missiles is running out, we've had claims today, first by Ukraine, Alexei Arestovich, the Ukraine's chief spin doctor, propagandist, if you like, that the Russians have, thrown away 80 of their missiles, and that their stock of missiles is about to run out. There's, and of course, an even more substantive claim from British intelligence, essentially repeating the same thing, that, this is a last surge by the Russians of, they've thrown everything they've got because they're about to run out. Now, I have to say that these claims come with absolutely no credibility, at least for me, because they come from essentially the same people, the same sources, who have been telling us that the Russians are about to run out of missiles ever since March. Given that the Russians self-evidently haven't run out of missiles, or at least haven't run out of missiles in the period between now and March, then why believe that all of those people who made those claims, which were clearly false or wrong claims previously, why assume that what they're telling us now is true? I have to say this, I see no sign of any slackening in Russian missile strikes. And on the contrary, what seems to be happening is that, in fact, the scale of missile strikes appears to be increasing. And I say that putting aside this surge, which may just be a temporary surge, that we saw yesterday and perhaps today, because supplementing these, big air-launched, sea-launched cruise missiles, the Tomahawk equivalents and their like, that the Russians have been bombarding Ukraine with, what we've seen over the last few weeks is what you might call attacks on Ukraine by what appear to be micro missiles. Now, these micro missiles are these geranium drones, which perhaps are better understood not so much as drones or kamikaze drones, as people are calling them, but rather as rather stealthy cruise missiles. They're very small, or relatively small. They're extremely cheap. They can be produced in massive volumes and are apparently being produced in massive volumes. But unlike drones, they don't seem to be controlled, at least not for most of their flight, by some kind of controller operating them from some sort of base area. Rather, a bit like cruise missiles, the bigger cruise missiles, they seem to strike principally fixed objects following a pre-programmed course towards those particular objects. And they're relatively small, they fly relatively low, they're difficult to shoot down because they're so small. The Ukrainian air defense system doesn't really seem to cope with them very well, because they operate on a pre-programmed course and they don't apparently receive signals. It seems that they're difficult to jam, and they do seem to be posing increasing problems, or at least they have been posing severe problems for Ukraine. And obviously, the universal assumption is that they're Iranian, that the Russians are importing them from Iran. I would say that Iran has again denied this. They've insisted that these missiles, or drones, or kamikaze drones, or micro cruise missiles, these geranium drones, are not actually Iranian. I think most people would doubt that. Perhaps the best explanation is that they are in fact Iranian drones, but that they're actually being made in Russia under license, which seems to be consistent with some of the lettering that has been found on them. So it seems to me that at the moment, if anything, the volume of strikes and attacks on Ukraine both from the combination of these big missiles that the Russians are launching from the air, from the ground, from the sea, and these micro missiles or drones, if you like, suicide drones. The volume is actually growing at the moment, and for all I know will continue to grow. Somebody told me some months ago, actually, that provided you sort out the production lines and you know what you're doing and you have this thing organized, production organized efficiently and well, volume production of these kind of missiles is not especially difficult. I mean, it can present some problems. You need all the right materials to do it, for example. But provided you have those materials, provided you have the engineers who know how to put things together, provided you have the machine tools to put them together, it's actually possible to create pretty big and efficient production lines and to churn these things out in the kind of volumes that we have seen. And this person has also told me, or at least that's what I understand, that the microchips that these types of missiles use are far from being the most sophisticated. The kind, in other words, that Russia makes itself and can easily import from China if it needs to. So it looks as if there's no reason why the Russians can't keep up these missile strikes, and I take, as I said, all these claims that the British are making at the moment as a pinch of salt, with a huge pinch of salt. I suspect they look to me like the special pleading, the rather defensive briefings that one might get from intelligence officials and analysts who sense that there's growing skepticism about the briefings that they have given in the past. Anyway, that's where we are with these missile strikes. We'll see, as I said, what does happen, but I repeat again my agreement with those who think that the Russians are gearing up eventually for a sustained attack on the Ukrainian energy system, but that hasn't yet come. That this is really testing the vulnerabilities of that system in preparation for the massive attack that will probably happen to coincide with the big Russian offensives that are probably on their way. And I think there's growing evidence that those offensives are indeed coming. Firstly, there's news that an operational group, as it's called, of, well, at least a team of around 1,000 people from Russia, military people from Russia, has now arrived in Belarus. And one person who's written to me, who is, I understand, somebody who served in the Indian military, he's made what I am sure is the correct point, that this is not actually a military unit. This 1,000 people looks like a headquarters. In other words, they're the people who are coming to Belarus to organize the arrival of the much larger forces that are to come, to sort out the logistics, carry out the plans, set up the intelligence systems, coordinate the interface with the Belarus military, work out how to use the railway system, the Belarus railway system properly. And I suspect that that is indeed what the purpose of these 1,000 people who've now arrived in Belarus is. And we've also seen a rather intriguing counterattack by the Russian military towards Liman, that town which the Ukrainians captured a couple of weeks ago, to the great anguish and grief of some people in Russia, especially in the Russian blogging and military reporting community, and to the euphoria of the Western media and of some people in Ukraine. And it seems that a force under the command of General Lapin, the commander of the Southern Military Theatre, the man who worked with the person who's now the overall commander of Russian forces in this war, General Surovikin, in the capture of Severodonetsk and Lysychansk back in June and July. Anyway, troops under his command have launched some sort of a counterattack against Ukrainian troops near Liman, and they seem to have recaptured a number of villages in this area, and they're now apparently fairly close to Liman again, though given that Ukraine is still said to have numerical superiority, I do wonder whether this is less of an offensive and more of a spoiler attack, or perhaps a reconnaissance in force. I have no idea. But anyway, the fact that the Russians seem to be taking aggressive steps in this area may be, again, as I said, a sign that, they're starting to refine their ideas about the offensive that is to come. And coming back to General Surovikin, about whom I've said quite a number of things in recent programs, he's recently celebrated his birthday and has received congratulations from all sorts of people, including many of that highly hypercritical military blogging community and reporting community, Russian reporting community that I've been talking about. And he's also been visible. He's been going around giving pep talks, at least some pep talks, to some of the soldiers. I don't know whether he's actually touring the battlefields. Perhaps he is. Given what one's learnt about him, it would be consistent, it seems to me, with the nature of his personality, that he's going around meeting the various troops and commanders that he's now in overall command of. Now, I'm going to just add one very last comment, at least for the time being, about General Surovikin and about his appointment and about the sense of relief and optimism that it seems to be generating amongst not just this Russian reporting and blogger community, but apparently his appointment has been very well received by the troops on the ground. Now, I'm going to repeat here a point which I have made many times in many programs about a particular feature of the Russian command and system, the Russian military, which is different from that of the United States. And that is that Russian soldiers expect the commander to lead the men in battle, to be there, to be visible to the soldiers, to be close to the battlefield, to inspire them, as they would say, to great deeds, to have a feel for the battlefield, to show courage and calmness and under fire. That's very different from what senior commanders do in the United States. In the United States, the very top officers, the generals, those sort of people, tend to run things from their headquarters in the rear. But that is not the Russian way. The Russian way is the commander is at the front with the troops. There is a headquarters in the rear. That's run by the chief of staff, and the two are supposed to work together as a team. Now, I've often said, and I want to repeat again, I am not here to pass judgments on which is the better system. Many Americans, when I brought this up, have commented to me that the Russian system is wasteful, that sending highly trained, highly expert commanders to the battlefields where they could be killed or wounded, or worse still, captured, is irresponsible and reckless and extremely wasteful of top personnel. and that it makes much better sense to keep these important and valuable people in a safe place where they can conduct the battle effectively. And I could see a lot of merit to that kind of thinking. But the point is, it is not the ethos of the Russian army, and it is not the ethos of Russian soldiers. They expect, as I've said before, to be able to see their commander. They have a more Roman or Napoleonic conception of the art of command. And I think a lot of the problems, a lot of the criticisms that we have been seeing from this Russian reporting and blogger community, and remember, many of them appear to be ex-officers or soldiers themselves, people who've actually served in the military, is that they feel that the overall commander up to now, General Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, is trying to run things from Moscow, from his headquarters in Moscow. And this is something that contradicts their ethos, their military ethos, their understanding of what a commander is all about. And in fact, you get repeated complaints about armchair generals or court generals, bureaucrats, faraway headquarters or offices, people who are out of touch with the real battle. And there's been a rumble of criticisms of General Gerasimov and of the Chief of Staff and of the General Staff based on those sort of critiques and comments. Now, all of that may be completely unfair. It may be completely groundless. But let me repeat again, we're talking about the Russian army. We're not talking about the American army. Perhaps an American army, perhaps American troops accustomed to a different style of command would have no or less difficulty with this sort of thing. In Russia, amongst Russian soldiers and Russian officers who expect to see their commander in their midst on the battlefronts, meeting the men, inspiring them, as I said, to great deeds, the fact that the overall commander is in Moscow is not something that has met with a great deal of approval up to now. And as I said, if you follow the critiques and comments that have been made and spread and written, you can begin to understand some of the resentments that there have been directed against Gerasimov, which of course have accumulated during the period of retreats that took place in September and the first week of October. So the fact that there is now a commander in the battlefronts, somebody that they can actually physically see, somebody who meets the troops, gives pep talks to them, that's something which already you can see has tended to lift morale. Now, it may be that Surovikin's appointment is going to make little practical difference to the style in which the war is fought. But of course, if he's physically there and his mere presence lifts morale, that will have an effect. I would say that, going back to what I've said before, that he does, on paper at least, look like a highly competent commander, and perhaps his presence, putting aside the morale factors, will make a difference. He does seem to me, as I said, on paper at least, the obvious person to coordinate a complex and large-scale offensive of the kind that is apparently in the works. So I'm not making any comment about General Surovikin's abilities or lack of them. I'm just explaining some of the critiques and commentaries that one sees from the Russian blogging and reporting community and from Russian soldiers and from people on the ground, because I don't think that a lot of the reporting in the West understands this difference in military ethos and perhaps accept some of these criticisms and critiques without getting a feel for their context. It's important to remember that the most celebrated award for the Russian military, I'm not saying it's the highest, I know nothing about the structure of Russian military awards, but at least the most celebrated one is Hero of Russia, formerly Hero of the Soviet Union, but now Hero of Russia. So that gives you some sense of what Russians expect of their commanders and indeed of their soldiers. They expect them to be heroic. And heroism is something that you achieve on the battlefield, not in your headquarters, tucked away far behind the lines in the rear. And by the way, if you go back to the Second World War, General Zhukov, Marshal Zhukov, the overall commander of the Red Army, the actual ground forces, the forces that actually fought the battles, he commanded the Red Army during the Second World War in exactly that way. He was very often on the front lines. He was highly visible to his officers and to his troops, and he did sometimes take serious risks, serious personal risks, which American officers, even at that time, probably would not have done. Anyway, enough of that. What is the situation then on the front lines? Well, I talked about this counterattack by General Lapin's troops towards Liman. There's been less news today about what's going on in Bakhmut and around Donetsk city. I've no reason to think that the advances that were taking place yesterday have slowed down or been reversed in any important respect. Everywhere else, it seems to me that there's been constant fighting, but very, very little actual movement. And I still get the sense, I'm increasingly getting the sense that the lines, the front lines everywhere are stabilizing, and that it's starting to look as if the Ukrainian offensive, or at least it's increasingly looking as if the Ukrainian offensive, which began at the end of August, has now probably come close to running its course. If so, and I'm not a military person, so, take this with a pinch of salt, but if so, then I agree with the various commentators whom I have seen who would regard this offensive as a strategic failure. It has captured a certain amount of territory with deserted villages and small towns, but it's not defeated any or destroyed any big unit of the Russian army. It's not inflicted any significant casualties, as far as I can see, on the Russian army, and it's not captured anything up to now that really matters. Its time window is closing. It could be that with the ground getting soft, with the weather continuing to change, with the winter coming, with the Russian reserves arriving, with General Surovikin doing whatever it is that he's doing, with the missile strikes happening, that someone in Kiev, President Zelensky, General Zaluzhny, who knows whom, will say, well, we've got to try to get this offensive started up again. We've got to try something big or important somewhere in some battlefield. This is our last chance. This is our only remaining hope of turning things round. I have to say that as of the moment of making this video, the prospects of achieving that kind of success are looking to me very remote indeed. I would repeat instead what I have always said, that the much more rational approach for Ukraine to take is to try to start negotiations going with the Russians at a moment when they still can say that they've recovered a significant amount of territory, however important or not it may be, and can therefore claim to be looking for an end to the war when they are still, in perception at least, on a high. But as I don't expect the Ukrainians to approach this war in that way, I think it's more likely, much more likely, unfortunately, that they will try some kind of an offensive of that nature, or at least try and pull something off like that. But that doesn't mean that they will. Maybe they are increasingly running out of resources or something to do that. And maybe anyway, the window to do that is now either so far towards closing or has closed as to make it impractical. But that, it seems to me, remains a possibility that they're going to try and pull something off. But on the assumption that it fails, which is what I expect, on the assumption that things continue in following the same dynamic, then I would repeat again, the offensive overall has been, up to this moment at least, a strategic failure. And if it doesn't achieve something soon, something more important soon, then it will remain so. It will, far from having improved Ukraine's overall position, it will have weakened it, causing Ukraine to lose large numbers of trained men, of which it has only a diminishing number, deplete its reserves at a time when its manpower pool has been mobilized probably to the fullest possible extent, and importantly, most importantly of all, depleted its weapons pool at the time when the ability of the West to replenish Ukraine's weapons is reducing, and the flow of weapons is now reduced to a trickle. So that's where we are with the situation on the battlefields at the moment. Now, economic news, of course, continues. There's been a dip in gas prices in Europe, which has caused a lot of excitement on the part of some people. Professor Sommerfeld, who wrote that, in my opinion, completely wrong assessment of the state of Russian economy for Yale University a short few months ago, has now resurfaced. He's written a piece in the Financial Times telling us that Europe is not going to suffer any severe problems with gas or energy this winter. I have to say, I think this is a temporary relief. Some people think that it's because of milder weather in Europe and an increase in US LNG shipments. US LNG shipments might have played a role, though people like Robert Habeck and members of the French government are complaining bitterly about the cost of US LNG. As far as the weather is concerned, I have to say that in London, at least where I live, I still get the sense that the weather is getting colder, despite claims that I've seen in some places to the contrary. But it could be that further east, in Germany, temperatures have been higher. I don't know. I'm not going to try and guess. My own view is that if there's been a fall in gas prices, it's probably due partly to increased LNG shipments from the United States, though I expect these to start tailing off fairly soon, but also to the various financial manipulations of European governments to try to keep gas prices low. In other words, to government interventions on the natural gas markets and government pressure on gas distributors. And the worry is And that's not going to turn things round. It's going to store up more problems for later in winter. But that's where we are. Meanwhile, in Britain, the financial crisis, which was sparked by the Truss Kwarteng's government disastrous mini budget of a few weeks ago, has now restarted again. There's been more problems in the government bond market. British government bond prices are spiking once more. Yields on gilts, in other words, the interest the British government has to pay on loans is growing. And the Bank of England has been forced to extend its renewed QE program shortly after it was telling us that it was going to wind it down. Now, when it did resume its QE program in the days after Kwarteng's disastrous mini budget, it was supposed to be ending on the 14th of October. To no one's surprise, it now looks certain that it's going to continue beyond that. So the situation in Britain continues to deteriorate. And I have to say, living in London, I'm getting the increasing sense that the economy is in a spiraling decline, which is proceeding faster than the government itself understands, and which is not yet being fully captured in the statistics. Anyway, that's where we are. I can't speak for other countries. I've had a visitor from Germany, a British visitor from Germany, who described to me an utterly chaotic situation in the German railway system. It could have been that she just caught it on a bad day. I have reason to think otherwise. But certainly in Britain, things do not look well. And I agree with all of those who feel that, at least in Britain, we are in a downward spiral. And as I've said, I think the same is true in Germany as well, and in Europe as well. But this thing has yet to fully play out. We're still early in the season. It's only autumn. Winter has yet to come. There's said to be a period of high pressure coming with very low temperatures. We'll see whether it materializes. As I've said before, I'm not a climate scientist or a meteorologist or anything of that sort. So we'll see where we go. But for the moment, things don't look good in the West on any front. And I hope I've adequately described the situation with respect to Ukraine. Now, one very last thing, we've now seen more people, almost exclusively, by the way, in the United States. It's interesting that it is in the United States that debate about the wisdom of this blank check that is being given to Ukraine, that doubts about this are highest. We've now had the former retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff coming along and saying that President Biden, rather than talking about nuclear Armageddon, should be working hard to get Ukraine and Russia around a negotiating table to bring this war to an end. There have been more commentaries about this in the United States. More people like that seem to be coming forward. We will see whether things break and what the direction of events is going to be. My own sense is that the president himself, President Biden, remains deeply committed to Ukraine, will find it personally extremely difficult to change course, if he's even capable of doing so. In other words, for things to really change in the United States, one of two things must happen. Either President Biden ceases to be president, either because he resigns or is impeached or has to retire because of health problems about which one hears so much, and his successor decides to embark upon a different course, or perhaps more plausibly, the famous checks and balances of the US political system start to assert themselves as they might do if the Republicans sweep Congress in the midterms in November. But at the moment, as I said, the only real debate, the only real discussion about the war is happening not in Europe, even though it is here in Europe that the crisis is deepest, but in the United States. Testament, in my opinion, to the still persisting political vitality which exists in the United States, which contrasts very sadly with the desert we see in Europe. Anyway, that's me for the day. Obviously, more things will be coming. We'll see, as I said, what General Surovikin does. We'll see whether the war does indeed stop because of the autumn weather and the rains and all that. And we will see what exactly the Russians are planning to do over the next few days and weeks. And I'll be here to cover all of that. In the meantime, remember, you can find us on other platforms, on Locals, on Rumble, on BitChute, on Odyssey, on Telegram, and now also on Rofkin. Links under this video. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links also under this video. Don't forget to go to our shop, get yourself the great things that you will find there, our mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check a subscription to this channel. That's me for the day. More from me soon, and until then, have a very good day.